Okay, so now we can talk about a couple of arguments in favor of redistribution, and they're a little bit more philosophical. Although the first one we'll talk about, which is known as utilitarian justice, as an argument in favor of redistribution, there's a little bit of economics involved, namely the law of diminishing marginal utility. So the basic idea of utilitarian justice is that we want to maximize total utility within a society. But for simplicity, let's just assume we have a society of only two, Jack and Diane, and the economy only produces apple, and apple consumption is subject to diminishing marginal utility. So if we draw the total utility function, that would look like this. So we have here the apples and here the total utility. So total utility would look something like this, but the marginal utility from apple consumption, which is the derivative, is always positive but decreasing. And you can see that here. So the first apple gives you a total utility of 6. If you have a second, your total utility goes up to 11, but the marginal is only 5, or the incremental. If you have a third apple, that's better than having 2, but the increase in extra utility is only 4. If you have 4 apples, your total utility is 18, but the incremental utility or marginal utility from the third to the fourth, that's only 3, and so on. Okay, so now if we assume that Jack has 4 apples, then Jack gets a total utility of 18, and if Diane has only 2 apples, she gets 11, so 18 plus 11, that's 29. Well, but if we redistributed an apple, so we take away 1 apple from Jack and give it to Diane, then Jack will lose 3, will drop from 18 to 15, but Diane would gain 4, so there will be a net gain of 1, which means if we distribute our 6 apples equally, and if we assume they have both the same utility function, then total utility could go up from 29 to 30. So that's the basic idea of utilitarianism, and this idea goes back to the English social philosopher Jeremy Bentham, who lived between 1748 and passed away in 1832. And little surprisingly, the Benthamian thinking is also known as utilitarianism, but although it has some theoretical and maybe philosophical appeal, it is obviously extremely limited in practice because first, utilities vary across different people, and if we assume that everyone has the same utility function, that would be an extreme simplification. And last but not least, even if people have different utility functions, how do we organize the redistribution according to individual utilities? So there's simply a practical implementation, or there's a limit to the practical implementation. But nevertheless, in general terms, the legacy of utilitarian thinking is still reflected today in the fact that most countries do have a progressive tax rate. And so if you take away the rich people a little bit more, well, they don't feel it as much. And then if you give it to the poor, well, then it adds a lot of utility there. Okay, so that is the idea of utilitarian justice. So you should see that it's a little bit related to the law of diminishing marginal utility. And maybe if you ever think about progressive taxation, you will see that legacy of that Benthamian concept in it. But of course it is, as I said, very difficult to implement. Okay, so much about utilitarianism, and the next video we'll talk briefly about John Rawls and his justice principle.